Jerry Sandusky, what a lovely fella. Eh? His wife apparently heard his victims, or at least one of them, screaming and did nothing. Now, we've had serial killers in Canada whose wives, partners, must surely have known what was going on. In Britain a few years ago, you heard of the Yorkshire Ripper? Well, the wife of the Yorkshire Ripper would wash his blood-soaked clothes. I mean, why are these people not charged, as well as the actual direct culprits? Solomon Friedman has represented all sorts of people, both good and bad, and I'm sure quite ugly as well, in Ottawa, where he joins us now. How are you?
I'm very well, Michael. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, I know that lawyers probably think that there can be hysteria in reaction to what goes on in the law. We don't really understand everything, and there are other details, and there's a context. But if a woman hears a victim screaming in the basement, if a woman is washing out the bloodstained clothes of a serial killer, at what point do we say, well, hold on, you knew about this, you enabled, you allowed the crimes to take place?
Well, in the Canadian criminal law, we have what is known as parties to an offense, right? You can have, the strangler, the murderer, him or herself. But if an individual aids or abets, and that means if they either assist or encourage the commission of a crime, under our law, they are in fact as guilty as the principal perpetrator. Now, we see that gets applied unevenly across the board, but in theory, that is the law as it is written.
What about allowing? Now, we're talking about people who, Hamolka is something different, but in the case of this man who abused so many children, it does seem that his wife heard the crime, knew of the crime occurring, and did nothing to intervene.
Well, we have to be careful about commenting on cases about which, we may not have all the particulars. I'll say this, though. In general, citizens of this country have no positive duty to report a crime. And that'll change, of course, if you're a teacher or a police officer or somebody who has some other special duty imposed on you to assist the authorities. But in general, one can simply walk by a crime being committed and in that way do nothing legally wrong. Morally, completely different story, but legally wrong. However, that line is crossed when you become either, as I said, a party to the offense, or if you become an accessory after the fact. Remember, you can't assist in the planning, but you also can't assist in covering up an offense or concealing an offense. There's a difference between passive ignoring, and we can talk about whether or not someone has knowledge, and assisting after the fact, which is absolutely a criminal offense.
So does silence not imply consent?
Well, of course, the other side of silence is knowledge. And that's something that the Crown always has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Remember, we're always erring on the side of caution in our criminal law. In other words, we understand how harsh the criminal justice system can be and how profoundly the sledgehammer of the law can affect you. So we don't want to widen the net to unfairly entrap those who don't deserve it. But at the same time, absolutely, the Crown, if they can prove that a person knew, assisted, covered up, conspired, etc., if they can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, then that person should be charged and prosecuted.
The issue of proximity. If you see a crime and you walk past, you may be a coward, you may be someone who has lost all integrity, but maybe you haven't broken the law. If someone, though, is living with, married to, sharing a bed with someone, and they are aware that person is committing crimes, horrible crimes, over and over again, the law still cannot touch that person?
Well, of course, when it comes to the knowledge, you can both know actively, but we have a concept where we try to be able to catch those who would use that as a defense, and that's called willful blindness. And in our law, we equate willful blindness with knowledge. In other words, if you really knew something and you knew you ought to make an inquiry and you make a conscious decision to ask no questions, but you really know, you are considered to have had knowledge of the offense. And if you do anything to assist, cover up, etc., even if it's whether it's preventing someone's escape or concealing evidence after the fact, one can easily become a party to the offense. But like I said, that's theory, Michael. It's not always applied equally, and as we see, there's often a gender division in terms of who will be charged as a party, who will be charged as an accessory after the fact, and that's something that should be addressed.
Let's talk about that. Paula Todd just last week or so released a wonderful piece of work where she tracked down Karla Hamolka. Now, we've all read probably too much over the years about the crimes that were committed, but in such a case, surely it's entirely obvious what was going on. Seemed to me police incompetence, I don't know, many other factors, but we also had the defense put forward that she was a victim too as a woman. That is not unique. That has been used time and time again. Because she was a woman in the relationship, the man was committing the crime, she was, if anything, a victim and not a perpetrator.
And I think we always have to be careful, and I think the prosecution should certainly be careful about automatically ascribing blame or relative moral blameworthiness based on gender. You know, we're far past an era where we assume that women can only be passive victims. We know, for example, that, you know, crimes can be perpetrated equally by people of both genders. But when it comes to, for example, the Karla Homolka case, we have to look at what did the Crown know, and most importantly, when did they know it? Because, of course, a prosecutor will often make a decision to lessen the charges for one party in order to obtain evidence against another party. Now, of course, with the hindsight that we have today, that may look different. It may have been a very different calculus on the ground in terms of proving the case against Paul Bernardo.
Well, I don't think we need hindsight to know what went on. It was completely bloody obvious at the time. And we know that some of those girls would not have been killed. Well, her sister was involved too, if we hadn't had the lessening effect of a woman in the car at the same time. There are so many layers to this, but it makes me very angry when simple policing incompetence resulted in someone who is profoundly evil now living a life with their own children, while the families of those girls who were raped and murdered will never, ever probably have a good night's sleep ever again. And I just, why certain police officers were promoted and not suspended or punished, I will never understand. But that's not for you to answer. You said that we live in an age where we understand that people of both genders, well, there are probably 9 different genders now, can commit crimes, but that's not always applied, is it? A male teacher, for example, who abuses a girl is going to be treated very different from a female teacher who abuses a boy.
Absolutely. Although, you know, there are some positive signs. For example, we can look at the prosecution of the Tory Stafford murder, where in that case, even though the co-accused was charged, she was convicted of first-degree murder. She provided evidence against Michael Rafferty. Yeah. So I think we have perhaps a step forward in terms of how we look at co-conspirators, be they male or female. And there we saw very equal treatment. She pled guilty to first-degree murder. She served as a witness against Michael Rafferty, and she assisted in huge measure to obtain a conviction against him. I hope that's a positive sign in terms of the equal treatment of parties. But like you said, you know, this sort of stigma hangs over policing and Crown attorneys.
Yeah. Just a very general question to end, because you're one of the most sensible people I know working currently in Canadian law, and I really do think you believe in justice rather than law. I see law as a means to an end, which is justice, and protecting those who deserve protection and punishing those who merit punishment. But do you think we're moving in the right direction in terms of our legal system? Are we actually getting better results? Are the police more empowered? Are the public more safe?
Well, I don't necessarily think there's a connection between the public being safe and the police being empowered. I think what we've actually seen is, in fact, a step backwards in terms of the rights and liberties of ordinary citizens at the price of increased police powers. I think people need to be very cautious about assigning increasingly serious powers, increasingly severe powers to the state and hoping that will make them safer. I don't think that makes the public safer. I think that as individuals, we look to the state to take care of certain responsibilities in public safety, but people need to take a responsibility of their own. And hopefully we're going to see a step forward in that regard when it comes to policing and law enforcement.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I don't, though, think that empowering the police is giving the police more ability and authority to look what we're doing in a car, in our home, with our kids. I think it's more when real bad guys and gangsters are involved, they can actually be cops and not social workers. However, as always, an amazing pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.